Welcome, guys. Good afternoon. Um, Thank you for spending a part of your day with us. Um, me, Nirav Kataria, I'm a principal consultant with AWS Professional Services, joined by a team of consultants from professional services. Collectively, between me and the moderators, we've got a lot of experience doing large scale migrations to AWS, and we are here to provide you with as much information based on our experience as we can, um, to make sure that this hour that you're planned to spend with us is well worth it. So, having said that, let's go ahead and get started. The topic of the webinar today being best practices in planning a large-scale migration to AWS. The agenda that we're going to follow is we'll talk very short, real quick about migration to AWS itself. We're going to spend considerable amount of time talking through three distinct stages of cloud migration, that being the pre-migration phase, what would you do in preparation of a migration, the actual migration phase or stage, i.e. how would you perform a migration, and the last post-migration phase. In that we will cover once you perform a migration, once you light up um, once you light up your existing environment into AWS, what are some of these additional considerations, best practices, and then we will leave about 10-15 minutes towards the end of the presentation for Q&A, question and answers. We would we would definitely welcome any questions as we make progress during the presentation. If there are specific questions on individual slides, feel free to post them in the chat window. The moderators are standing by to provide you with with a response in the chat window. All right, let's go ahead and kick it off. So before we begin, before we start talking about stages of adoption on the slide, Quentin, can we bring up the first poll question to gauge what's the maturity of our audience? Are you guys trying to do some small project in AWS, or do you already have a foundation set up in AWS? Have you done a project, you build yourself a foundation? Are you actively migrating something or looking to migrate something? And then last but not the least, you're done with migration and you're right now optimizing or transforming your existing IT running in AWS. Perfect. It looks like about 42%, 43, 45. So pretty much, close to half of the participants on the call today, on the webinar today, are in an active migration phase, i.e., you understand AWS and you've built yourself a very solid foundation in AWS that will allow you to perform a migration, an active migration of an existing application or workload to be running in AWS. And that kind of goes well with the cloud stages of adoption slide that you see, the picture that you see right now on your screens. Again, this is based on our past experience working with a lot of enterprise accounts, a lot of customers, such as yourselves. What we have typically observed happen is adoption of cloud, adoption of cloud goes through multiple stages. The first stage being a project, or for lack of a better word, this is where customers would tend to try things in individual silos. So you might have a network team, you might have a corporate IT trying out a VPC. You might have an application team testing out RDS, or you might have different application owners trying to do agile DevOps test, so on and so forth. So it basically starts with a very small project. It's not of a high value. It only allows you to try test what the technology has to offer. It allows you to familiarize yourself with what AWS is. Once you're done with a small project, once you realize or once you identify what's the real use going to be for you, we've seen a lot of customers go into the second stage of adoption, which is foundation. This is the stage when, if you were operating in a silo, if you were testing RDS on your own, if you were testing out an EC2 instance on your own, this is the time when you will reach out to the corporate IT and you will start making this project or test a real scenario. So you'll go back to your corporate IT, define a requirement of running a real application into a cloud, and therefore seek their guidance, seek their help in setting up a good solid foundation with network, security, disaster recovery, backup, so on and so forth, so that all of that foundation will allow you to run your existing application or an identified workload into AWS. Once customers go past that stage, comes the third stage, where now that you understand the technology by doing a small project, now that you've built a solid foundation in which you can run one of your existing application or a couple of your existing applications, with that maturity comes a stage when customers start thinking about migration into cloud. That's the point when, depending upon what's your real use case, customers tend to follow either the green projectile or the blue projectile. And each one of them is slightly different. So the way it's represented on the picture, if you are going to build a net new application, you will think of building this new application in a very cloud native design or in a cloud native architecture, and therefore you will follow the green projectile. Versus if you are running an existing application in your data center or a colo or a colocation service provider, that is the time that you will follow the blue projectile and you will really think of migration or migrating your existing workload into AWS. That's the stage that we're going to get into more details. What you see after that migration phase is it also gives you an opportunity to retire your existing technology debts. And we're going to talk about an example on what are some of those considerations or what are your options to retire your technology debts. Let's go ahead and start talking about the first stage of migration, that is the pre-migration stage. So the first things first, what we really want to talk about, even before you start thinking of migration, even before you plan your first workload to be running in AWS, what do we recommend based on our experience is identify key resources. And these key resources doesn't have to be an expert knowing cloud technologies or knowing AWS. What we are asking you to do is, today your IT organization may look something like this. There will be multiple silos. There will be an architecture team, there will be a support team, there will be an application team, there will be a security team, a network team, and so on and so forth. What we're recommending you to do is identify these key resources and set up a center of excellence. The Cloud Center of Excellence, or CCOE, that stands for Cloud Center of Excellence. This will have representation from all of these individual teams that you have in your IT organization today. For example, people from architecture, people from security, people from operations, people from leadership teams, finance teams, everybody will be a part of this Cloud Center of Excellence. The reason we're recommending this is these are the guys, this is the internal team who has a lot of tribal knowledge supporting you, supporting your applications, supporting your compliance and security requirements. And that tribal knowledge is what we want to be represented in the Cloud Center of Excellence. By doing so, what you're doing is bringing together one single team which has pretty much knowledge across all the domains of your IT organization, and therefore any problems, any decision making, any aspects of architecture, security, compliance, finance, operations can pretty much be dealt by this center of excellence or cloud center of excellence. So that's our first recommendation. At which point, once you have identified the team, once you have set up the team, once you have identified a project charter for the team, our recommendation is when you think about starting your migration journey, in pre-migration stage, we highly recommend that you do a first project. Okay, and what do we really mean by that is we have seen a lot of customers going down the path of performing an analysis paralysis of their entire IT portfolio. Imagine your environment having 5,000 workloads and you doing an assessment of all of these 5,000 workloads to identify what's the best way to migrate, what each of those 5,000 workloads will require in terms of security, authentication, availability, backups, so on and so forth. If you try doing this analysis and paralysis, you will spend a lot of time. And it may not be perfect either, because by the time you're done with analysis, a part of your IT environment would have changed. And therefore, recommendation here is please don't get into a lot of analysis and paralysis before you perform a migration. We highly recommend you start with a very small first project. The project doesn't have to be a significant complexity. It doesn't have to be a super complicated project either. What you really want to do is just kick off a project, and in the process of doing so, what you're doing is you're validating the foundation. You're making sure what you created in AWS to run these applications or to run this first project, is it valid? What kind of network, what kind of routing requirements, what kind of access requirements would you need? And therefore, by doing this first project, it will allow you to perform a very good validation of the foundation that's already created in Amazon Web Services. Once you're done with that, what also happens is now that you've validated a foundation, you will also, in the process of performing the first project, identify and validate a methodology in which you will be performing this migration. So when you start small, allows you to do a good validation of foundation, process, methodology, and apply that in full to perform one successful migration. With each migration, when you tackle a new use case, you will go through a similar process at the beginning, and thereby you will get a lot of lessons learned out of this pre-migration phase, which will allow you to identify any such corner cases which could tend to be problematic when you perform the actual migration. So the term we used on the previous slide, and we thought it would be good to kind of benchmark, to baseline what the term really means. So the term we used was landing zone, and what we really mean by landing zone is a pre-configured, a secured enterprise AWS environment. Think about, if you guys are aware of AWS, think about this as your first VPC, as your first AWS account. And for folks who are not aware about AWS or VPC, VPC it's a virtual private cloud. It's an extension of your data center. You will run this VPC on a predefined IP address defined by you. You're porting your IP address. The route policy, the route tables, the security posture of this VPC is pretty much defined by you, and therefore, this is an extension of your data center into cloud. So, in summary, a landing zone is an environment that will allow you to iterate and extend over a period of time based on your use cases. With every project, with every use case, with every first use case that you try in AWS in the pre-migration phase, what you're really doing is you created a minimum viable landing zone 1.0, and as you uncovered additional requirements, you modified your landing zone, and therefore, by the time you're really done with the pre-migration phase, what you have is a very solid foundation. Multiple versions of your data center or your extension of your data center, your minimum viable landing zone, which, by the way, could also be a code, something like a CloudFormation template that AWS supports. And therefore, what's happening is even before you really started tackling migration in itself, you came out with a lot of learning, you tried a few projects. In the process, you were able to validate methodology. You were also able to build out a landing zone that pretty much suits your requirement and support you when you'll be performing the migration. So summarizing that first stage, pre-migration stage, start small and iterate with use cases. Do few smaller projects and perfect your minimum viable landing zone that will support you through your migration or first set of migration. Create a center of excellence. All the knowledge that you have within the organization, that's a good knowledge. Definitely port it over, transform over, bring that learning in when you're creating a cloud center of excellence. Do a small representative project. Create a process based on the lessons that you've already learned doing this small project. And in the process, validate the foundation and methodology. A few considerations that we want to leave behind in this section. Prevent doing a lot of analysis paralysis. Don't waste a lot of time because for all you know, your IT is changing. Avoid doing an upfront discovery of the entire portfolio because, again, as I said, if your migration is a 2-year journey, within 2 years, a lot of things are going to happen to your IT. You might be retiring hardware, you might be refreshing hardware, you might be retiring some technologies. So you don't have to do an upfront discovery of the entire portfolio. Create a minimum viable landing zone or an MVL. Code it, if possible, so that you can version control your MVLs and have each version of your MVL available to spin up during the actual migration. All right, so moving on to the next slide. The section that we want to cover in the next few slides is stages of cloud migration or the actual migration itself. The first key learning that we want to share with you is there are multiple ways in which a migration can be done. Both or all the ways of doing a migration are right ways, but then there are some additional considerations that you want to think about. If you're looking at the picture on the left, it says Big Bang migrations, or you can also think about that as a waterfall methodology. What's happening in that type of a strategy is you're looking at an entire application portfolio. Assume that you have an application that's built on a 3-tier architecture. What you're doing is you're picking up your web tier, your application tier, your database tier, everything picked up together and one entire application migrated at a time. When you follow that kind of a Big Bang migration strategy, it's obviously a little more time consuming because you're moving an entire set of application with every possible tier and every possible workload. Because it's a little more time consuming and it's a significantly large effort, there could be increased risk because say hypothetically your first application, which is a 3-tier application, had 60 servers. Now you're going to move 60 servers in one batch. All the data associated to those 60 servers will have to move in that batch. And if one of those systems out of 60 fail during a migration, you'll have to fail back on your entire migration strategy. So that's where it comes with an increased risk. Compare that to the picture on your right, where what we call it as an iterative migration methodology. Think of an agile methodology. And what's happening is you're breaking down the application into more functional components, into smaller functional components, such as web tier is dealt separately than an application tier, than a database tier. When following a strategy like that, or an iterative migration strategy, because these efforts are in smaller functional groups, they work really fast. You will be migrating each tier faster because the number of servers and the amount of data that needs to be moved with that tier or with that group of servers is small, and therefore it also comes with a minimized risk. As we move on to the next slide, here's a slightly blown up example of the agile or the iterative migration methodology. What we're doing is we're breaking up functional components of an application and moving each one of those functional tier in one sprint, and sprint being 2 weeks in here. It doesn't have to be 2 weeks. That is just the representation on the diagram. But this is the process that we highly recommend. This is the methodology that we want you to assess and wherever possible apply in your migration strategy. The next slide, and before I get into the details of this slide, Quentin, can we pose question number 4? Polling question number 4, how will most of your applications be migrated? I like that. When the polling was open, 100% was rehost. That's a fairly good mix of response. People have identified rehost, replatform, re-architect. It's pretty much an equivalent mix. About 55%, 57 now, say that it will be rehost. So just to level set before we get into this, slide, Gartner did a significant amount of work about 4 years ago, in identifying 5 R's of migration. And what we at AWS did, was we took that definition, that effort that Gartner had already put in, and what we came up with, based on our experience, was 6 R's of migration. Each R stands, and it doesn't have to be 6, it could be 7 in future. But the way it goes right now, the first R is retain, which is you don't know what you're going to do with this application. Either the application is going to sunset in near future, or the application is going to retire, or the application has some complex technology dependency on a USB dongle, some requirement which will not allow you to migrate this set of application, and therefore you have decided to continue running it in your data center. You'll maybe revisit this application in future, but as it stands today, you're going to continue running it in your data center, and that's retain. The second type of R, or the second R strategy, is retire, where, as the name suggests, you're going to retire the application because it has duplicated functionality, or it used to do a function which is now available in some other application, or it's going through hardware refresh cycle, so on and so forth. And therefore, because you're going to sunset this application in future, you're going to consider it as retire. The third R strategy is rehost. People also tend to call it as a lift and shift. And what you're really doing is you're forklifting an application along with the operating system configuration, kernel fine-tuning, application fine-tuning. You're just lifting and shifting it from your existing data center and running it in AWS. The fourth R strategy could be re-architect. What you're really doing is looking at components of your application, and you're re-architecting some of these components of your application. And a very good example of such is in a 3-tier application, you identified that you may not need to run a database the way it is today, but you may want to consume a managed service such as an Amazon RDS. And therefore, you might have to go through a little bit of a re-architecture of your application. Your code might change a little bit, but basically you are re-architecting the whole application to suit your modern needs. The fifth possible R strategy is refactoring. What you're doing is you're looking at your application code, you identify what's the desired end state, and you're completely rewriting this application. Perhaps for reasons such as, now that you're planning to run this in cloud, you might want to consume some cloud native functionality such as auto scaling, or auto recovery. And therefore, you want your existing code, which is tightly coupled hard-coded IP addresses, to loosely coupled code. And therefore, you are rewriting the entire code. And that's refactoring. And then the last one is replatform, where you're running your existing workload. A good example of such, you're running your SAP instance on IBM AIX, and you want to run it on Red Hat Linux going forward so that it allows you to be ported in AWS or a traditional native x86 architecture. So you're swapping out the underlying platform from a RISC architecture to an x86 architecture. So those are the 6 R's. Back to the slide. What we're recommending is once you have identified an appropriate path for a given application, whether the path is rehost, whether it's re-architect, whether it's re-platform, what have you. Once you've identified an appropriate path for your application, we highly recommend setting up what we term as a migration factory. If you really think about what a migration factory is, as the name suggests, depending upon the migration path or the R strategy, for example, rehost, you will set up a migration factory which will have resources who are qualified in performing application discovery using some tools, who are trained to perform a lift and shift using either AWS provided tools or a partner provided tool. And therefore, their expertise being they're trained in usage of all these tools that will allow you to rehost a particular workload into AWS. And so people with that kind of skill set, with that kind of training, with that kind of background, will be a part of a migration factory that's responsible to perform rehost. Okay. Moving on to the next slide. What we really want to emphasize is while you are performing this migration, regardless of the path that a particular application is going to follow, or a migration strategy that you will follow for a given workload, what is imperative, what is of utmost significance is remember there will be additional constraints on your resources. Resources being your application owners as well as your IT resources. Your application owners will now have to perform a double duty of, while supporting your migration initiative, they're also keeping the lights on and running business as usual. And that would be additional constraint on your human resources. On your IT resources, there will be additional constraints such as the same network bandwidth that was used to provide, that was used to serve your business traffic is now also supporting seeding of data into AWS in preparation of the migration. And therefore, given all such constraints on human resources as well as your IT resources, what is significant during a migration phase is you set up a very good governance and communication framework. Okay, you got to track progress, you got to set up dashboards, you got to set up reporting templates, you got to set up a way in which you will have an ongoing communication with all these stakeholders. This will come in super handy, and trust me on this. This will go a long way in ensuring that your migration is successful. That kind of brings me to another polling question, and I want to say this will be our last question in interest of time. What tools does your company use in tracking migration success? Awesome. A lot of people, about 54, 55, going up to 60%, people are saying they use Jira, and which is an awesome thing, by the way. It's a very good practice to use something like Jira, which will allow for a dynamically updated reporting communication mechanism. If you were to think of a static web page that you will go and publish a dashboard on, it'll lose its purpose. So let's move on. To summarize that section, what we are asking is or what we're recommending is prioritize agility. Think about smaller iterative migration methodology compared to a big bang migration. Try small, validate, apply lessons learned. Set up a migration factory depending upon your use case, depending upon your path of migration. Highly recommended set up a migration factory with specialists with expertise in performing that part of migration. Don't underestimate the power of tracking, communicating the progress. Over communication is never harmful. Some considerations: appropriate migration, choose appropriate migration path based on workload profile, set up smaller sprint teams, consider additional contention on resources, both human resources and IT resources when you think about migration. So moving on to the last stage, which is post-migration, this kind of completes the whole circle. We started, our first slide in the pre-migration was identify key resources and set up a competency center or cloud competency center. The competency center will come in handy once you're done with migration as well. And where they will come in handy is they'll help you define, based on their experience serving your internal customers, the application owners, the business units, they will help you define a very standardized governance framework. They have been there, done that. Help them use that knowledge which exists in your IT organization to serve your internal customers better. Don't forget the importance of organizational change. Now that you're running a workload in AWS, there will be aspects of organization change management that, again, your Cloud Competency Center, which is nothing but your existing IT organization's representation, will come in handy. You might have to go and teach or communicate with your application owners that if it is a development environment, the systems will be turned down in the evening until next day in the morning to save some cost. And that's pretty much valid, that's possible, but this needs to be communicated. The change that the organization will go through, especially your IT organization, by adoption of a cloud type strategy, will have to be communicated. And it has to be run formally as an organization change process. Now, in next couple of slides, I want to say about 3 or 4 slides, if you go back and think about the first slide, stages of adoption, after migration, there was this blue bar where we spoke about potential opportunity to retire your technical debt. So the next 3 slides, we want to cover what are your options to retire your technical or technology debt. Let's play a scenario that you are migrating your existing data warehouse into AWS. Following the iterative migration methodology that we recommended, you migrated your data warehouse and you are now using rehosting strategy. You are now running your data warehouse on top of an Amazon EC2 instance. For folks who don't know what's an Amazon EC2 instance, think about that as a virtual machine available from Amazon on an on-demand, pay-per-use, hourly basis. So it's basically a virtual machine that you provision yourself, and you're running data warehouse on top of these EC2 instances. This is a good enough success that now you're running your data warehouse in EC2 instance. But are there additional opportunities? And the answer is yes, there are. Once you're done with this migration, once you stabilize, consider optimizing the existing data warehouse workload by swapping out an underlying database or a technology as such with a fully managed AWS service such as an RDS. For folks who don't know about RDS, it's a managed relational database management service offered by AWS. What it really does for you is, if you think about 80% of your support and operations task that you have to do on top of an existing database on-prem, it will include things such as fine-tuning, performance tuning, capacity planning, availability management, patch management. All of these are routine, mundane tasks that doesn't really add any value to your business. But you still have to perform them to make sure that the database on-prem is up and running and is performing to a desired level that your application owners or your business groups have a need for. If you were to outsource, if you were to offload these routine mundane tasks by consuming a managed service such as an Amazon RDS, that will free up your resource to focus on what's critical for business. Imagine that with a single checkbox, you can run a two-site active multi-AZ RDS. What else do you want? You don't have to manage availability. If an underlying system in a multi-AZ deployment fails, we will promote the secondary to become primary, and we will replace the failed instance with a healthy one, and we'll synchronize all of this for you. Wherever possible, do evaluate and consume a managed service, free up or offload the burden of routine mundane tasks, and thereby get better flexibility, better performance at an optimized cost. And then that's not the end state either. You swapped out databases. Now go a level further. Consider swapping out the entire technology stack, such as data warehouse, with a warehousing solution that Amazon can offer. Redshift is a data warehousing solution that Amazon offers as a fully managed service. It's the fastest growing AWS service in our history. And if you consume a service such as Redshift, you're no more responsible to capacity plan. You're no more supposed or you're no more required to forecast a capacity for your warehouse cluster 2 years down the line. Imagine when you consume something like Redshift, there are 2 or 3 dials, such as what is the performance you want, what's the availability you want, and what's the capacity do you need today. You set up these dials, and we will ensure that you get the desired capacity at your required or predetermined availability levels. All of that configured as a dial of a button. And this is the example where we wanted to talk about how can you retire your existing technology debt, going from a fully self-managed, supported data warehouse on-prem to a fully managed Amazon Redshift. And in the process, you're not even asked to change any code. For most part, your existing code will continue running as is, and the underlying technology will change, allowing you to retire your tech debt, and in the process, give you better availability, better performance, at a better cost. So let's summarize that post-migration section. Apply learnings. Can't emphasize enough on that. The center of excellence that brought your learning from the past is now going to apply all of that learning, all of that tribal knowledge into your migration. We're going to support you all the way through post-migration, set up governance for you, create reusable building blocks wherever possible so that they could be repeated, they could be faster execution, continue to evolve. Don't rest once you are done with migration. Look for additional opportunities. A few considerations. Organizational change management process is important. Please provide it enough of importance and run it as an organization change management. Don't underestimate power of communication. Use existing IT organization knowledge. Migrate and optimize. In past, when I did one of these seminars at reInvent, after my presentation, a lot of customers walked into me and said, why should we do rehost? Because if there are issues with our IT, we're just going to bring them over to AWS. And that's where my response was, rehost is not a bad strategy. You can think of rehost as your first step and then migrate from there. And there are advantages to do that. Now that you're already running in AWS using the rehost migration strategy, you got additional options. You can experiment with virtually unlimited capacity and resources available in AWS and optimize your existing workloads without taking any downtime or outage. So consider doing that. Last couple of slides before we open up for question and answer. 2 slides that we wanted to leave behind is everything that we said so far. The first ones. It doesn't have to be risky. A lot of customers have done it. if you go to our website, you will see a lot of customer case studies. And therefore, there's a lot of knowledge and there's a lot of tool assistance available, both from the AWS as well as our partner ecosystems. So quickly touching upon a few tools in the migration space itself. There's a tool called as Application Discovery Service. As the name suggests, it will go and discover every application that you're running in your data center. Plus, it will also draw up a dependency map for you. So if you were to prioritize which application should go in AWS first, depending upon the number of interdependencies, the Application Discovery Service will let you do that. Once you discover a workload and its dependency, when you're ready to do a cutover, there's a separate tool available called AWS Server Migration Service. The tool, as the name suggests, allows you to migrate an existing server into AWS, and it supports a wide variety of use cases. For example, depending upon the amount of data that you want to move with this server from on-prem, Server Migration Service will allow you to go ahead and start seeding data ahead of time and define a frequency in which you can synchronize your data or create a consistent snapshot in AWS and launch an EC2 instance out of that snapshot that's already available in AWS. Likewise, there is an AWS Database Migration Service. The tool is specifically designed to assist or to help you migrate your existing databases from on-prem into AWS. It kind of supports a wide variety of use cases. So you can go from an on-prem database to an RDS instance, or you can optionally also consider changing your database engine, going from a MySQL on-prem to an Aurora DB in AWS. It'll support all kind of use cases, or most known use cases. And there are additional tools that I will not get into details in interest of time. I'll move on to the next slide. And this slide talks about a lot of existing system integrator partners that are available with very niche skills to assist you in performing migrations. And you can imagine any kind of use case. For example, I have an SAP system running on AIX in my data center. Can I migrate this SAP on a Red Hat Linux running in AWS? And the answer is yes. And there's a partner to do that. Or there's a partner who specializes in doing that. And a lot of these partners are not just supporting migration use cases by throwing a number of resources at it. A lot of these partners have also developed their own intellectual property or IP around automation and tool-assisted migration to support your specific use case. No matter what your use case is, we highly encourage you. You're welcome to visit our website. If you were to Google AWS Migration Competency Center, you will come across a hyperlink, a URL on our website, which will walk you through all of these existing partners. Optionally, you are also welcome to reach out to your existing AWS account team to help you. We'll make you a recommendation based on your use cases, what's a good partner or a tool that you should be using in your migration strategy. I think that's all I had. So, quickly summarizing, 3 stages of migration: pre-migration, migration, and post-migration. What you're really doing in pre-migration is identifying your key resources to set up a cloud center of excellence. This cloud center of excellence will help you perform smaller pre-migrations and learn lessons out of it so that you can start building a minimum viable landing zone and then iterate upon your landing zone to a point that supports your migration needs. When you're ready with the landing zone, you will start performing your migration. It's highly recommended that you think about an iterative methodology of migration versus a big bang migration. Set up specialized migration factories depending upon your path of migration so that your success goes higher. Enough of stress on track and communicate progress. A good governance goes a long way. When you're done with migration, some of the post-migration stages, apply lessons learned by your cloud competencies center. existing IT organization, create reusable building blocks, and continue to evolve. Don't just migrate and stay like that. Highly recommended that you continue to evolve and in the process gain better IT at a lower cost.